So this morning, I have the pleasure to welcome two of the core faculty members of ISTA, the International School of Temple Arts, which is in many ways like a sister community network to Tamara, really working with consciousness around eros and sexual energy, also as a means of spiritual awakening and peace work. And why we have this session this morning, which is called Repair, Reconciliation, and Restructuring, is really to have ISTA share these core faculty, who I'm going to introduce in a few moments, share about this really strong journey they've been on of going through a cycle of repair and really reckoning around power and how power is used with those of us in leadership, especially as we get into these more liminal realms of eros and medicine and all the consciousness work that we are doing. And I want to say, to me, maybe of all the things that we have done in this A Cry from the Future, I think this perhaps could be the most important, because this is really looking at how we as human beings take responsibility and how we really beautifully see ruptures or bumps or trauma points getting triggered as really opportunities for deeper healing and deeper integrity. And I think that's the conversation we really need to be having right now as a culture. So I'm so grateful to ISTA for wanting to come here and share so vulnerably. And the two that I have here from ISTA coming to share, the first is Raffaello Manacorda, who was with us on Tuesday in the Eros Day. And joining Raffaello today is KamalaDevi McClure, who is a mystic muse and mentor. So with that, I have the great pleasure to welcome on Raffaello and Katie now. Hi, you both.
Hello. Hello, John. Hello, KamalaDevi.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I know this is like potentially a long time coming and a really beautiful big moment. And yeah, just to express again my sincere gratitude for being willing to just be in this process, which I want to say, what I know is that the process you've been in is not unique to ISTA. You know, this reckoning around power and really sexuality is something that's been happening in the culture at like large. And it is because people in organizations, in leadership, are willing to be in the reckoning, to be in the process of a repair, that we can really make strides in our cultural evolution. So I'm so grateful for you to come here and share, what have you learned? So I know that you've been on a strong journey really the past 18 months. And I guess maybe to start, I'd love to hear kind of the story. What happened? How did it come to your awareness that there was needs for change? And then what process did you go through, and where is that leaving you now?
Go ahead.
KamalaDevi, you want to take this one?
Such a big question. Having been with ISTA through various, incarnations, I'll say, like as an organization, we've been growing, and there's always been criticism. There's always been challenge and outside, misunderstanding and judgment. And then also always within the fabric of the mystery school, we like to call it. But really we're offering week-long seminars and supportive workshops all around the world. And we have been growing. What we find is that inside the fabric of what we do, we need to be able to take feedback, to self-reflect, to look at, when we step on toes or when there's conflict in any community, how do you resolve it? And I think what happened, and the recent years is there's been just a massive like awakening, new distinctions about trauma, new distinctions about power. And as collective consciousness is waking up to that, we as an organism have to go, okay, how do we upgrade to meet that? But also, if we're going to be, addressing the call of the future, if we're going to be changing culture, what's that upgrade look like? That's a sustainable new way. That's not just, the kind of punishment conversations or structures that are out there currently. So we're really looking at new, transformative and visionary ways of breaking free from the drama triangle.
Yeah, so just to add maybe a little note on that and subscribing everything KD shared. So from the inside, also another way to look at this journey that John, you're catching us, in the middle of the journey. So it's a process in the making, is also, or at least the way I have experienced it, is also this maturing as an organism, as an organization, and moving from a phase, from let's say a founding phase, where really some new ideals and some new practices are brought into the world by visionaries and people that have also a certain capacity to basically just keep going, and in a certain way also ignore all the criticism or the pushback that always happens when you bring something new. And that's a certain phase. But then at some point, as an organism, but also I can relate to that individually, we've had to also grow or come into a next phase where, because of the size that we have grown into, because of the impact that we have done, there comes a moment, which is a very delicate moment, where, from my perspective at least, you need to shift this way of being, in a sense, and you kind of need to reckon with the impact that such a large organization has. The beautiful, overwhelmingly positive impact for sure, but also the not so good impact, that after a decade or more in operation, you have accumulated. And so there is a real shifting and process of looking in the mirror and asking tough questions. And one of them is, can we, still be in the narrative of, what we're doing is controversial, so of course there's going to be criticism, we just need to keep going? Or is it actually the time to stop and listen to what's coming from the outside? And, while I'm very happy to celebrate here together that we took this second choice to stop and listen and reflect, it's also not been easy, because it's really a shifting of worldview, and it requires maybe a level also of reckoning and looking at the mirror and understanding how, as humans, even with the best intentions, we operate, we bring all that we have, our gifts and our shadows. So it's a humbling process. It's a growth process. At times, it may feel like, oh my God, the entire world is against me. How is that possible if I'm doing such beautiful things for the world? But as you say, it's not unique to ISTA. And I know, for example, that Tamara has had to go through a very similar process through the decades. And how do you come out of it? I mean, I'm not here to present any easy solutions, but I just want to celebrate for anyone, individually or collectively, that's going to go through a similar process, that actually there is immense growth available for that. It's not easy, as you were saying, and we can expand more on that. But it's also a process of maturation, maybe from a teenage, more like, I'm here and here's my gift to the world, and everybody please listen to me, to a certain phase of adulthood where we are really more and more aware of the impact we have in all ways. Because that's the thing, as we grow in power and influence and reach, then our impact grows, and many things start to become more delicate when we grow so much. So it's also wanted to give you a little bit from the inside perspective of how it's felt for me personally and for many of us to go through this.
Beautiful. I mean, there's so much in there that I want to tug upon. And I saw somebody asked, what incidents prompted. And I'm sure there were many. And just like, from what I understand, I'd be curious to hear how it's, just kind of like what the process was. Because I think in general, we're coming from a culture where especially if we're more like in leadership, like the like mainstream is that, if there's harm caused, which I just want to say is like invariable as human beings, like we have impact and we're always going to have impacts we cannot fully control or know. That's part of being relational beings. And I think we're coming from a mass culture where it's like, like politicians like deny and hide. And that's kind of what we've been so programmed into. But yet we're in this moment, I think, as organizations, and it's like, okay, we like know that's actually perpetuating the like trauma. So it's vulnerable to even be like, oh shit, this thing we didn't want to happen, somebody felt hurt for whatever reason, all the reasons people felt hurt, especially when you're doing more edge consciousness embodied work, like that is going to happen. That's happened in, I think, every org. But I'd be curious, like what I've understood, I guess, is that, ISTA's like walking in these edge spaces. And for some people, that can be triggering to traumas. And at some level, what I understood the main rub was like whatever was happening, like put some people into their sense of trauma, and they didn't feel like, that I didn't like want that, or that like maybe we didn't know how to like handle that well. So I'm just curious, like if you could speak more, like what like were some of the rubs or like concerns, and then what process started in like ISTA, and was that just immediately easy, or like what process did ISTA have to go through? Like what conversations happen in like faculty? And I'm sure there was some like, holy shit, no, and then like, okay, and like just any of that you can share. I think the story is so profound. So whatever you feel comfortable with, I'd love to hear.
So I'd like to back up first and start with ISTA's vision. Like at the core of what we're doing, it's about awakening individuals like to their sovereignty. So it's empowering people with their sexuality as well as love and power in the world. And with that as a huge intention, because we're really liberating people from kind of cultural conditioning and their smallness, so waking them up to the God self, essentially through shamanic practices. And so as we're doing that, we know we're, playing with fire. These are deep forces that we're working with. And we often structured our teachings around having 3 teachers or facilitators to hold, our various seminars are always held not by one person for whom power could corrupt, but like, hey, we have 3 facilitators, and then they offer feedback if someone's off or out, and deep in that, we're trying to listen. Like, okay, where were we out or off or need repair? But what I think the big challenge became that the listening was from within and not listening to. There's a sense of, I'll listen to the facilitators or feedback from above. And there wasn't a deeper listening to what impact that's having on the community members after they leave the ISTA field, when they go home, when they're integrating, they come back and say, hey, this didn't feel right, or I wasn't fully in consent, or I didn't feel like I got my power back. I actually felt, that I didn't have the power to speak up or be in, and that wasn't, those complaints weren't, as we heard them and tried to grow and course correct, we weren't really listening to that. And so at some point, post like the Me Too awakening, I would say that's happening on the globally, there was a really beautiful initiative to say, hey, if ISTA's not listening, we're going to form, a community is going to form to create a space to take these complaints and bring them to ISTA's attention. And so there was a small community committee that started to gather complaints. And then after those complaints gathered, there was also a lot of people who did, haters of ISTA and what we're doing, and sex negative people that also gathered around that. And it became a very, very strong, unified, unprecedented force of criticism that really was some people wanting to make us better and strengthen us, and some people wanting to take us down. And so we, as ISTA, said, well, how do we show up for this? Where can we have talks and negotiations, and where can we look at where we can strengthen, and what can we learn from this process?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To John, to relate to your question, because I love the way that you're also getting into the nitty gritty. So what kind of things happened, and how did we react? So I would say there's like two kind of events that came to our attention. One is individual people in ISTA trainings. Keep in mind that we work with more than 10,000 students by the date of today, and growing. So individual people having a less than ideal experience, experiencing harm of different kinds. By the way, it's not always related to anything sexual. It could be also just being facilitated in a way that doesn't feel compassionate, or doesn't feel listening to the person. And this happens, from time to time. So we had a collection, as KamalaDevi was saying, of these incidents, basically, and the journey of learning how to listen properly to these difficult experiences of participants has been a journey for ISTA. We've had to learn, we've had to create better structures to get this feedback, because it's not always easy, to even give that kind of feedback of I felt harmed. There's all kinds of incentives or pressures, psychological pressures that could lead someone to just silence it and sort of like deny their own experience. So we've grown into our ability to listen into that. So that's one thing. And we can speak more about it, of course. And then there is a more, I would say, ideological, cultural sort of opposition that we're also facing. And that, for example, could be exemplified by the statement of ISTA is a cult, and that is not something to ignore, or it's definitely something that I personally want to engage in conversation with. But also at the same time, it's important to know that touches on philosophical questions, on cultural questions, on difficult definitions. What is a cult? Like, where do we draw this line? And so, as you probably are aware, there is a big movement of basically busting cults and anti-cults. And I think I've reflected on this a lot. I just want to say a few words about this second point. I think there is tremendous value, in people just basically going out with common sense, armed with common sense, and inspecting what different organizations and schools do, and going like, does this make sense at all? Because a group of humans, can create a microculture where anything can happen, really, as we've seen also in past history, like things that would sound absolutely outrageous, like, from, I don't know, feeling threatened by society and then arming themselves with weapons and creating a sort of paramilitary organization, to all kinds of creating a culture where sexuality is exchanged for favors or owed to the leader, to the guru. Like, anything can happen, basically, in a group of humans. So there is a tremendous value to people going with, some common sense and some intelligence and looking at what's happening. But on the other hand, there is also the possibility of basically starting to consider anything that veers away from ordinary consciousness, or what you could call, for lack of a better word, common sense understanding of what is right to be doing. So anything then becomes a cult. And that's dangerous as well, because basically, if we go down that route, then it means anything that cannot be explained rationally or cannot be, put into a neat table is by nature dangerous. And that, to my perspective at least, means basically cutting off a huge part of the human experience, whether you want to call it ceremony, ritual, ecstasies, and all things that by themselves are not only not dangerous, but are tremendously inspiring. And then for an organization like us, the big question is, how do we navigate? Because it is true that in ISTA we facilitate experiences that will potentially bring people into different states of consciousness, than the ordinary one. And this is without using any substance, or vegetable or mineral or animal of any kind. And so how can we do that while at the same time making sure that we come back to a common ground before and after the experience that allows every person to integrate it and not feel like they've just been on a crazy ride and with no way back. So we're constantly learning on that. But surely, part of our work, as KamalaDevi was saying, and of our vision is to facilitate ceremony, is to facilitate ritual, is to facilitate experiences that are touching both on the spiritual and on the erotic. Does that, make ISTA cult? Well, I guess it depends on the definition that you give. And for some people, definitely so. Absolutely. That's outrageous and completely wrong, as well as, many things that Tamara does would fall into the same category. So we're learning to navigate that and to incorporate the feedback and to really respond to it and become more permeable to it, while at the same time sorting out what is, deep felt feedback versus a cultural or philosophical conversation that we're also very happy to have, by the way. It'd be awesome to have a public debate on what cults is. Are they always dangerous? Are we a cult? Are we not a cult? What is a cult? Et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot there, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a range of what's been coming to us. And you were asking, was it easy for us to listen to it? No, to be quite frank. We've had to really soften ourselves and introduce more humbleness and humility in our genetic codes or our operational codes, because at first many of us have been through a phase of denial at the very beginning, and I'm very sorry about that, but it is the truth. Oh, and I can't hear you.
I was muted. Yeah, I think that is so important, is to acknowledge. I mean, so much of what's important that we learned from Tamara is really in our film was really creating space for the full process that we have. Because the thing is, what's problematic about cancel culture and kind of the culture of political correctness is that it creates a lot of energy around really trying to tiptoe and do things perfectly and save face, which doesn't actually address all of the underground layers that are what, like, a repression of like different layers in human beings are then what creates unconscious actions that can't be in the feedback loops where like deeper relationality exists. So I think that what we're saying, Tamara, is like they create these spaces, which I think is what we're trying to create here over large as a culture of like, can we admit like, oh, at first, my first response, because I was scared, was to defend and deny. And that's so human. And I think we as leaders need to be creating spaces where we can be seen in that too, as a part of a longer journey of really reconciliation and like repairing. But if we just skip that step, we're not going to actually create enough wholeness to fully actually like integrate what is the information wanting to come in that is trying to be here to like upgrade us. And so there's a few layers. Like the cult, I mean, Tamara went through for sure a whole cult phase with the media, and they ended up leaving Germany partly because of that. And the thing is, I think it's also kind of like a impossible point. There's always going to be people, no matter what we're doing, especially if we're at the edges of culture, who are going to project onto us, both as leaders and as organizations. And I think there's some, I guess the curiosity I have in that, and I'm seeing things in the chat, and it's like more than I can actually fully like look at all and comprehend. But the thing is, I know that it's that in this process of receiving some very legitimate feedback and like concerns of real harm, has also then received tons of projections, tons of like outlandish like accusations. And I think that is something that leaders in this day and age step into, because we become projection fields, especially if we're dealing with like eros or sexuality or medicine work or so many things. So I think the question is like, what have you learned about that process in general in ISTA, and both of you in your journeys as leaders around like what it is our responsibility of becoming projection figures for others, especially people in our like programs, because people also like project on us, you know, as like God and goddess and beauty, which is where some of then the tricky dynamics can happen in sexuality. But like in general, like what is with that power and like projection, and like what have you learned is maybe like new approaches to doing that in the most relational, life-giving, ethical, if you will, way?
You know, what touched me from what you were sharing was how human it is to be, you know, when being like criticized, to just go into defense and then to feel like, oh, denial, defense, and then what it takes to actually come forward and listen to the feedback is an undefended heart, is to be vulnerable and say, okay, I feel safe enough to look at this feedback. You know, one of the things that I learned was how safety is a subjective sense in everybody's nervous system. And so, and that it's a necessary ingredient to growth. And so I might, as a leader, feel totally safe and be like, this is a safe space, right? And I'm providing a safe space, but that space is, you know, it's made up of the individual nervous systems involved. And so when, you know, as a collective, we're learning how to downregulate the nervous system, how to transmit from, you know, create safety at an individual felt level. But when it comes to repair, and when it comes to really starting to have the difficult conversations, there needs to be a container. And what is really clear, as you know, as a leader who's, like you said, projected onto, put on an altar, put on a pedestal, it's like I have to actually be held as human to human equal. And sometimes that takes a third party mediator. A lot of times that takes a group gaze. So it's not me and another. If there's a participant who feels like they've been hurt by me and they bring their complaint to me, there's such an inherent imbalance that they may not feel safe to bring it to me. They may not feel heard, you know, or if I say anything, it might be dismissive. So just the importance of bringing in more of a container and space. And so what I'd say the biggest changes look like is this process of listening to feedback came through mediated, held, you know, professional third party that could create a space where everybody could, you know, everyone's voice matters. And that third party presence is really important in our accountability systems going forward. And that wasn't available. You know, ISTA didn't have that social technology built in until just recently, really. Mute.
Thank you. I need to keep tracking that. So I'm wondering if you could just share a bit about that process. I mean, that's amazing. And I think there is a necessity, time and place for organizations and all of us to really be mediated from the outside. I actually know that Tamara was facilitated by our friend Mickey Kashtan, who spoke yesterday, when they were going through a big process. And I think that's their first time they've actually welcomed in outside mediation for them internally. And it was beautiful. And I know this was actually between you, I guess, and people who were harmed. But I'm wondering, like, did that, because often, although mediation can be its whole process, I've been part of many mediations that didn't go well. Then we almost needed like a mediation on the mediation. And just like, what was that process like? And what did you learn? And like, what did you take away as, okay, this is how we'd want to move forward doing this in the future. And this is what we learned, like we would approach differently, I guess.
Rafa, do you want to share a bit? Both Rafa and I were amongst a team, a subcommittee, to be in, I think it was, over a year's worth of talks. And so I really want to start as I turn it over to you, Rafa, by acknowledging and appreciating the safer sex spiritual community, like this coalition that formed to mediate with us. And I want to acknowledge how much we have learned from that year working with 3SC.
Yeah, so I'm happy to say a few words. I mean, there's so much that's been happening in the last 18 months, John. So we have, for example, this more, let's say, high-level mediation conversation with a group of intelligent and organized and clear critics of ISTA, and that's been a process that's lasted for more than a year. It ended up in a joint statement that's available on our website for anyone who's curious to kind of get an essence of the process. That on one level. On the other level, we had several cases of mediated one-on-one conversations as well with people that felt harmed, both participants but also within the organism, because once we open the Pandora box of actually things sometimes don't go very well, we found that also in-house in some occasions for sure. And then also we just simply had to turn outside of ISTA for support, for knowledge, for wisdom. So we hired external consultants that are experts in organizational psychology, in conflict resolution, in power dynamics. And that was a powerful moment, I think, for us to really realize that we can't know what we don't know. We need to look outside. We need to invite someone. We need to become really humble, spiritually, I would say, spiritually humble, to say, actually, we need someone else, to come in and help us with this. And it's been an amazing, amazing, beautiful process. But again, not easy at the beginning, because the sometimes the nature of a school, of an organization that dares to tackle the very core of life can become extremely self-referential. There are many reasons for that. And, I'm not condemning that at all or completely, but it does become an issue further down the line, where you come to a point where you realize that you can't just use the tools that our culture has are not enough. So this moment of turning to the outside and hiring someone and becoming students, again, I think was very, very important for us. And it left a very permanent mark on our culture. And particularly what we learned is you were asking, what do you learn? What did you learn? We learned a lot. We learned, for example, that simply exchanging feedback, and being authentic with one another, that works well when the power differential is not that big. But as KamalaDevi was saying, there are situations, and the teacher-student can definitely be one of those, where you cannot simply aim for authenticity, because the conditions of safety that we all as humans need to be authentic, I'll be authentic when I feel safe enough to be authentic. Those conditions are not a given. So we needed, ways to create those conditions in cases where those conditions were not available. And for me, one of the biggest learnings, and then I'll hand it over to KamalaDevi, was because you were asking about projections, and wow, this is such a topic, because I knew about projections, of course, it's part of popular psychology, even I've studied a little more in depth. But one of the things I didn't realize is that the moment that I am part of a collective creation like ISTA, so part of what I receive as projections are related to me personally, Raffaello, but also part of it is related to ISTA, to me being a member of this organism. And, while this organism grows in power and reach, I may not be aware if I'm not very, very attentive, and certainly I did need a couple of wake-up calls on that, but automatically the projections on me are also growing just by nature of ISTA growing and me being part of this growing thing. So all of a sudden, through the course of a few years, we went from something that I could describe as we're a bunch of crazy beings that love each other and are attracting whoever resonates with us, and this is all wonderful and very niche, to becoming one of the most well-known schools, organizations in this field globally in the world. And when that shift happens, the level of projections and the level of accountability that we as leaders need to have, the level of awareness changes. I won't say that it changes overnight, but it changes, in a pretty dramatic way. So I think for all of us, it's been also a matter of readjusting our self-perception and our perception as members of this organism to the reality that we ourselves had set in motion, but we were not always able to track day by day. And that's also a function of growth and success and doing things well. But when you stop paying attention to how the process of projection has grown, then you're up for a rude awakening. So I just want to also say, that we realize that we haven't always been great at tracking these processes, and we have to enlist external support for that. And because of that, in some cases, our process of repair has just barely started. I wouldn't want to give the impression that we have all everything done and neatly folded. It's like it's an awakening, and so it's a process that in many cases it's still needing to start or started but needing to complete and continue. And so massive realizations for all of us. And just to say that all of this comes with success, with growth, with outreach, and that's oftentimes when we get the most distracted and we get the most sort of like intoxicated with our own success, and life has a way of waking us up, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, Katie, do you want to jump in, or I have some things I could share?
Let me just highlight something that Rafa said, which is that we are in a process. Like, it's not like we're sharing with you the harvest of our completion. This is like raw, still learning, in the middle of the upgrade. And there are a lot of people who still don't feel safe coming to ISTA with its feedback. There's people who left our community hurt, and now we as we have been doing the internal education, as we've been calling in external mediators and support, we have safe mediation in place in order to take grievances and to really tend to repair of communication. They don't even know, a lot of people who were hurt in the past don't know the changes that we've made. And we're kind of still waiting for them to come through and say, okay, I feel safe now enough to do repair. There are many people who feel like the work that we're doing or the conversations we're having are just window dressing. Like, oh, you're just doing a PR move. And part of that is understandable. There's mistrust, there's hurt, and we're deeply in process. And so a lot of what we're doing, even implementing for the last year, our accountability process is it's a beta test, it's an experiment, and it's really vulnerable, and accountability takes multiple years. And so we're, still, people want to see us change and transform overnight. And it's like, well, to shed all those layers of past cultural conditioning, as well as guilt and shame of having hurt someone, and then learning new codes of how to show up to power and trauma informed, it takes some time. So I'm wanting to just acknowledge that we're, a work in progress, and that we really appreciate the feedback and the patience as we continue to learn and grow.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, yeah, it's so important just to say we're always in process, and there's not really a finished. And I think for me, I want to bring up I want to talk for a little bit. Here's a few things I want to touch, and then I'll weave it. But one is just, okay, I think one of the biggest paradigm shifts, for lack of better words, is in relationality. Like, we are relational beings. Harms and healing happens relationally. And even the idea of this being ISTA's issue or your issue, it's we're in a relational web. This is a cultural issue. And I think we lose something again when we pin it too much on I think we actually fall back into that patriarchal thinking of bad and wrong, you're bad and wrong. It's well, we're in a bigger system that this is spored out of, a mushroom coming out of the mycelium. And that's why we're having this conversation, because it's in dialogue that we can start to change the nature of that mycelial web. So in that, somebody asked about examples to back up theoretical talk. So I'm going to give an example of my own, because I've also faced this struggle. So I ran a program a while back, and after the program ended, life led me to be in a romantic and sexual relationship with one of the people that were in that program. And it was being somebody I knew who was like a friend, also prior. And it was beautiful. And then there was a time later when that person felt like, wait, this doesn't feel so like good anymore. And it became a process then in the organization I was in. And what I saw, which was ultimately a super beautiful for me, it was the scariest thing I've ever been through. Like eye of the needle. I went through the depths of like, oh my God, like I'm in so much trouble. Even that idea, I'm in trouble. This is punishment. I'm ruined. Oh my God. But the whole time it was one needing to reflect on like, okay, potentially there was something blinding me around my power dynamic as a leader or a former leader of that person, where maybe that person didn't have the fullness of consent in the same way that I like imagined, even though it was after, etc. And at the same time, holding this place in me that like, and the purity of love and eros isn't bad. And it's like having to hold both of those realities at once. And that can happen, and that there isn't, I want to claim there can be harm and there can be impact and there can be repair. But I personally don't believe there's right and wrong, and that we can also come to a full ethical code that we can make a rule that now this or this or this is wrong. Because I think that's part of the static, like patriarchal paradigm that actually creates more harm long term. So ultimately, what I realized in my process was mostly what caused harm was unconscious ways I was like trying to hide what happened with me and this person. That's what was causing harm more than it happened. And that was because of my fear, because of the conditioning that this was bad and wrong. And there hadn't been any unconscious hiding, had we made it transparent and embedded it in a community process, it would have gone a lot different. And then when we finally did that, that led to the healing that needed to happen, and actually is creating something where I think the organization is like growing. I'm certainly growing. And I think me and that person are growing closer and becoming deeper allies. So in saying all of that, and I wanted to share, so it's not all just on you all. This is also my issue. This is like other people's issues too. Like what, it's like, because what I'm guessing, maybe there are actual rules you have come to. So I'm wondering, are there rules, or like what have you come to as like the paths forward now, given these incidents? You know, are there rules? Are there principles? Are there like processes? Are there flow charts? Like, yeah, what have you like come to now of the like way forward that might be more healing and prevent as much harm in the future?
So I can start, and then I'm sure KamalaDevi has a lot to add. So one of the things we've learned, actually, personally, I've really learned this from some of our critics, is that this concept of safety net, it's not that I didn't know about it, of course, but just having a deep meditation on that. And safety nets, one thing that we really learned is that they need to be dynamically adapted to the level of intensity that we are inviting people into. So to make a practical example, it's not the same thing if you're going to go to a workshop on gardening and growing vegetables, which is wonderful, but has less potentiality to activate past traumas and all kinds of reactions than what we do, which touches the very deep core of the human being. So how can we create safety nets that are appropriate and dynamically adjustable to the level of depth that we take people in? And although I understand, that almost automatically, if I say safety nets, we can think about rules or regulations or agreements or stronger, tighter agreements. By the way, we have learned many years ago the importance of having like a strong agreement field in our trainings. But even that sometimes is not enough to prevent harm. But what I wanted to share is that another way to create safety net, which is not only through rules, is through creating available systems. So like systems that are available for whoever wants to use them. A practical example of that is creating an incident report form, for example, that people can use. If during or after a training and experience, where they can share their experience if they want, so anonymously or not. So that's one thing. Another system is having a held accountability process that KamalaDevi can speak more into that, because she's been really at the core of it. But that's a system. Some people may choose to use it, some people may not choose to use it, but it's a system. It's available. It's an availability. Another system that we created which is different from accountability, is a third-party mediation system. Now, I'm sure some of those who are listening can go like, duh, why didn't you think about this, on day one? This is so obvious that you need to have all these things in place. But actually, for us, it's been a process of learning it. We created many more systems that, in our view, did enhance the safety and the, let's say, holding of our containers. For example, the system of facilitating in triads, not one single facilitator, but three. That's also a system. But we did discover through all this process that our systems were not enough. We needed more. So creating all these systems is another way to provide a better safety net for those who need it, and those who don't have to. Or so it's available. It's just a matter of availability. So this has been an important part. It's not finished. It's still happening. Then there is also the issue of this is a whole topic, and I'm happy to go there. I'm just going to name it. The issue of protocols of sexual erotic interaction, between people that hold different power roles in a group, participants, students, team members, et cetera. We had a long journey with that. And, we came to a point of stability today, but it's also a dynamic stability, because that's a conversation that I would love, for example, to have in a public forum with more people coming from different sides. So I'll just leave it at that. Like one of the responses that we found to be the best, although it's costly in different ways, but it's also very effective, is to create systems that are there, just available. You can use it, you cannot. Another one that we just created is having a resident psychologist, that can help, that can support when we have intake forms from participants that want to take part in trainings. If there is a case that's maybe more edgy, they can have a conversation with a trained psychologist to determine whether ISTA is right for them. So these are just examples of systems that we implemented in the last, I would say, year and a half, and that are making our life much easier, but also primarily the participants' possibilities for having a safety net way more available to them.
Specifically around maybe some of the tougher issues, and it's how you even go about thinking about these things. So Tamara also has phases too. Like, for instance, somebody wrote, like, what about the time you were busted 20 years ago or 15 years ago for being a prostitution ring? And that's something Tamara is also worked with also, because they do a lot of sacred love service where people go in service through Eros to create healing, right? Just also want to say for people out there, there's a whole field of straight up sex work that is so beautiful. And I want to say I really want to help lift the stigma off prostitution, which I think is happening worldwide. And there's a lot of, I'd say, oppression against sex workers. I just want to claim that for that culture and those people at large. I stand in solidarity with those people. And there's so much we don't know about that whole world. So I think it's easy to, we live in a puritanical culture that's bad. So one is that. And then two, to get more specific around this issue of power dynamics and sexuality and sex with people that are in positions of faculty or teaching, and then students. Because at some level, people come to learn experientially. They're literally paying actually to have those experiences. And to me, that's beautiful and appropriate. So I think the question is, what is, how are you thinking about it? Did you come to rules? Or I'm even curious the kind of conversation. I'm sure you've talked on so many sides of these issues. And also, what are you trying to unlock in the collective both on like, okay, addressing the shadows, but also healing deeper cultural shadows for thousands of years of like a more puritanical sense that this is wrong overall. I know, that's a lot to take a breath.
Yeah. First, I want to just celebrate you, John, to in the mediation of this talk as a microcosm for a global conversation, and to really say, hey, can we come to this conversation respectful? Like, yes, there's feelings, intense ones on all sides, but how do we actually move forward is by the, is heart-centered, sharing the heart of the challenge. And probably the most heated of all the challenges that we've faced is this very conversation about power dynamics with teacher-student sexual relations. And it is one that initially, before ISTA became international even, we were a school of temple arts. It was at the heart of like, hey, let's explore and experiment with, yes, eros is at the core of every human. Yes, power dynamics are part of the personality and the roles that we play, but can we empower someone to get to a place where, they are in their sovereignty and they can make choices on an equal level, because there's a vertical relationship, right, which is teacher-student, yeah. And there's a horizontal, like soul to soul. And what do we need to do in our work to give people back their power, get into their soul relationship and be able to have that? Now, it's a huge conversation. It's not, it's not one for the last 5 minutes of our little, post-seminar session right now, but it is one, when you shared your experience vulnerably, thank you, that I heard you're like navigating those multiple roles is something that cannot be done in the shadows. It's not something that, we're going to hide this because then it pathologizes. When we actually bring forth to the system, and we used a lot of the technologies that we learned from Tamara and Zeg in terms of collective reflections and self-expression forums. Like, we did a lot of deep experimentation. We had tons of amazing, empowering successes. And also we had some epic failures and, broken hearts through that process. And that is, some of those we're repairing still, and we're, in a healing process. But as Rafa says, we're now establishing more codes of conduct, protocols, rules, systems. For many years, our process was very much we operated around values and principles, and it was a life force transmission. It wasn't codified, by rules. And I think when a system grows, like the more complex it gets, the more complex, the system gets. And so we're upgrading, but there is still a deep desire to empower people to come to, their full, like where the student becomes the teacher and those roles fall away, is still very much an evolution for everyone who's on a path of awakening, and until they're in that place, it is really important to be like, hey, let's really honor the roles. Let's create safety. Let's provide a space for your full awakening and not pressure or, let's navigate those multiple roles with some, with multiple gaze in order to not pathologize it. So I'll pause there by saying thank you for bringing up this really tender, challenging conversation. And where we've landed is that, teacher student, like in our level ones, we're not having sexual conduct between teachers and students because we're encouraging aliveness, erotic aliveness, but not sexual engagement, because that confuses the roles and doesn't create a safe environment for the initiation into this work.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there I want to respond to. I'm also wondering, Raffaello, there's something that you want to share just in that.
Yeah, so absolutely loving everything that Katie shared. Maybe I'll refer for a moment, to this prostitution busting thing. It's like, I think that's a clear case of where we also need to acknowledge that there may be different and conflicting values in our society. Not there may be, there are for sure, and it's sometimes important as well for us as leaders in this conversation to be clear, where do we stand? So for some people, the exchange of sexual services in exchange for money, let's say, or whatever other form of exchange is evil per se. It's something that should not happen, and it leads to exploitation and all kinds of harmful situations. I don't hold that view. I hold a different view, and a view that says, also sort of connecting to the conversation we had with you, John, in the previous interview, starts from acknowledging the fact that a community, whether it's a small one or a big one, needs to address the issue of unmet sexual wants, in some way, and that way cannot be left only to the private establishing of relationships for a number of factors. Not everyone can have a relationship of this kind or another kind in a private sphere, but also because we were discussing this together, John, the other day, there is a pretty clear link between those unexpressed and unfulfilled and unmet sexual needs, and then the developing of violent behaviors and different kind of disruptive behaviors in a community. So I'm really passionate about communities that sit down, and Tamara has done that in a very, very radical and, for some people, unconceivable way. But I'm passionate about communities that sit down and say, okay, so what can we do about this? What can we do about the issue of mismatches between sexual wants within a community? And while in ISTA trainings, we don't offer any kind of sexual services for a payment, like far from that. But I'm very proud to say that we very much welcome sex workers to our trainings so that they can learn, different tools and frameworks and ways to relate on a human-to-human level with their clients, if they so choose to, if they choose to follow that path. And because of that, I personally have been exposed to many sex workers of different kind, and I can say for a fact that many of them, or at least the ones that I've been in contact with, they do an amazing service to the communities that they work in my personal opinion. And of course, some people will disagree with that. But we can agree to disagree, for some moral structures or ideological structures, and not to mention religious structures, is absolutely a no-go. Sex should only arise in the context of a private, maybe even only in the context of a romantic relationship. I don't see it that way. I see it in a different way. I see sexuality as also a community issue, a community problem that needs a community to offer solutions to that. And while it's completely true that we are in most countries very far away, from having heartfelt, good, dignified solutions to this issue, well, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue experimenting, continue thinking. And actually, Tamara has a lot to teach about this particular issue. And I would invite everyone who's really curious about it to go and do some of their introduction courses, or even better, their love school, and really get to experience, because it's very different when you experience these kind of structures in a community where you can actually day in and day out observe by yourself how a community thrives or not, or what are the impacts of addressing the problem of sexual availability and sexual contact in a community way as well as in a private way. So that's a very passionate topic for me, and I've been on all the sides of this conversation, and all the different roles. And I have a lot of empathy, love, and appreciation for those who consciously choose to walk the path of sex work. We're not a school, to train that specifically, but we definitely don't shy away or turn away from those who want more information, more knowledge, more tools on how to walk that path in a better way.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's such. I just want to say, and I just want to again, like stepping back and just feeling all this. I just want to also just give my deep gratitude. Like you're holding incredible space for the collective to be dealing with this issue. I mean, and again, like part of the film we made, and part of what Tamara understands from their research is that the repressed shadow of sexuality and all that stuck energy that often then is used fascistly towards violence. Because I want to say all the people, okay, ISTA in general, Tamara, places are working with bringing consciousness to sexuality. And there's going to be a lot that comes up in that. And none of us are going to get it right. But the thing is, the alternative to doing that is the unconscious blocked life energies become quickly co-opted by fascist leaders and by also a disembodiment, which prevents us from feeling harms in the world, from feeling the biosphere collapsing. And that like this work is so like, we made this film because we believe this work is so fundamental to peace work and global healing. And it's going to be a journey through all the shadows. So I was going to again give that context, because that's why we're here. And yes, in that, we're going to learn a lot around like harm and a repair and like how we really become more relational beings. Because I think ultimately sexual energy, I'm thinking of Audre Lorde's essay, The Uses of the Erotic, The Power as Erotic, where she's talking about, and she's a now deceased Black feminist queer author, amazing, where like our deepest intuition, our deepest point of connection to life comes through that erotic knowing. And so to actually unlock that, I think is a key right now to really knowing what the flip we're going to do as a like species. I see Kitty, you want to say something? I want to just bring up the issue. Okay.
I just have to riff on what you're saying, because it touches so deeply that sex enters, like in order to heal trauma, we're here for peace work, we're here for healing. And there's a way that you can't heal sexual trauma from this, intellectual, just talk therapy place. Like we have to go into the depths of the soft tissue of where, enter that crack to break through it. And so a lot of what we're doing at these sex positive, culture creating events, and not just ISTA, but around the world, is like, hey, let's bring up this sexual life force to heal itself. And in that process, there will be a retriggering, your old wounds. And if you didn't have rape or molestation in your own body, the cultural wounds of rape and molestation are going to get activated for the healing. And so as that gets activated, which is happening at a planetary level, so is all of the criticism, the fear, and some of it's really valuable. Let's do this safely, but some of it's really just fucking activated. And so I just really celebrate what you're saying, which is, this work is peace work, but we're doing it, through the core and the most tender, vulnerable part of humanity to give people back their power, because feeling good, feeling pleasure is at the core of like what humanity is here for. And if we don't reclaim that, how to feel good and pleasure and alive in our bodies, if we don't actually reclaim that, like all the peace work in the world, just stopping war is not worth it.
Right.
It's like, we're here to be alive.
Right. Well, and I think this kind of comes to almost a core, I don't know what the right word is, like philosophical, embodied, epistemological question around consent. That is like the buzzword in spaces in general. And, consent it gets, because we have all this eros and all this joy for me of like wanting to express. And this, as a being in general, as a relational being, there's always that tension between my desire to express and then the like consent of other people to receive my expression in general. And again, I don't think consent can be made static as just even a simple yes, right? Because we all know sometimes people can say yes, but because of the conditions, not even fully consent. So in that, my question is, and also around power, you were talking about that, like the vertical power and wanting to help empower people. Like, I believe that we can't fully like disentangle or disassemble power dynamics. Like if I'm facilitating a group, there's a power dynamic there. I think what we can do is make them conscious and try to create other levers of power, because that's not the only dynamic in the room. Which I think is really important for people to realize there's so many other dynamics. I think for me, it's like, how can we make all of them conscious so that we can draw in more resource? But I'm wondering, just in this basic level, like what does ISTA even teach? I'm sure you teach it just in the basics of it. And then how has that process evolved of like, and even for just you two, even spiritually, not even just as like ISTA representatives, but as human beings on the spiritual path, like, you know, what is your understanding of consent and what's going to be healing and more evolving as we work with it?
I mean, I can say a few words about consent. So yeah, the level one, particularly the ISTA level one experience, has a lot to do with consent. And of course, you know, we draw from our own wisdom, but also from wisdom coming from other people, because we're not the only ones that have reflected upon consent, far from that. So it's good to get, you know, this as part of the global conversation, as you were saying. It's one of the foundational pieces in level one. And it's also, as you were saying, John, a buzzword. And what I don't mean that in a negative way. You know, like people are awakening to how consent is fundamental. And I always like to stress how consent is different from pleasure, you know, because we can be in very pleasurable states while being out of consent and vice versa. So to really nail this difference and not assume that everything that feels good is automatically sort of like good for my soul, because that's where a lot of the harm actually happens, or a lot of the unclarity happens. We have so many different feelers and sensors, bodily, tactile, all the different senses, but as well we have a soul or something deeper inside of us that can sometimes not feel in alignment with what we do that's pleasurable, you know, and there's so many examples of that even outside of the sexual realm, of course. There's so many things out there that are pleasurable but are not nourishing my highest integrity. So learning to unpack that, and particularly the challenge of learning to unpack that, coming in many cases from a personal story. Many of our participants come from a story where a biography where their pleasure has been denied. It has been in different ways just shut down. So they need to have a space to reclaim that pleasure, but that they also need to have experiences where they learn to differentiate what feels good to what is actually good for the whole of me, for my body, for my soul, for my mind as well. You know, because in different states of intoxication, whether I'm, you know, taken by deep desire for someone, I can make choices that later on turn out to not be so great, you know, and I think we've all had experiences like that. And so our approach and our challenge, beautiful challenge, is that, as KamalaDevi was saying, you know, you can choose to like sit on the sidelines and think this out, you know, think this consent out, and there is a value to that. But our choice is to create a living laboratory. And when you create a living laboratory, you need a very fine line between an environment that's, I'm just going to use this word, that's like sterile enough, you know, that people can actually operate in it without getting all kinds of germs. You would expect, you know, any laboratory to have those safety measures in place. But also it can't be so sterile that nothing spontaneous arises, because how are you going to learn, right, the tools of consent if, for example, me as a facilitator, I'm constantly following your every step and giving you guidance every step of the way? There needs to be some form of release of that, and that is, for example, our effort in having spaces during the program where we're not teaching something, we're not downloading, so to speak, a piece into the space, but we are creating a more of a social event or more of a time together where gradually, but with awareness, we can release some of that facilitation. And that's risky, because of course, when you do that, then life has a way of just popping up and cropping up in ways that can be wonderful and also triggering. And we're constantly in the inquiry of how to do that. Like, it's almost like, in a manual driven car, like how do you release that pedal slowly enough, but then at some point you do release it. It's also important to know, and I don't know if everybody knows that one of the choices that ISTA made from the very beginning is that, at least in level 1, for the first few days, and that is changing dynamically, we just put a complete stop. It's an exercise on sexual interactions, because there is such a value between anybody, participants, etc., couples. There is such a value to going into sort of like that state of real self-centered awareness, where you can then learn some tools before you even consider going into interactions. Now, is that a perfect system? No, obviously not. It's evolving and it's creating. But while many people believe, that coming to ISTA is all about connections and juicy times, actually what they discover when they come to our trainings is that this is not the case. It's a lot about learning difficult but important and simple tools, and facing certain feelings and emotions that maybe in an ideal world we would have been supported to face when we were approaching puberty, or moving from puberty into adulthood. Because of the conditions of how things are, we need to do it as adults. But again, this is not like, sort of like a theoretical training in consent. We do offer some theoretical tools and frameworks, but then this is at least our philosophy. We need to let people start to move in the space and have their own experiences and interactions. But the good thing is that what we've noticed is that you don't need to have any sexual interactions with anybody to learn about consent. It could be something as simple as negotiating a massage or a caress on the head. So that's what makes it, in a way, more approachable, because actually you can have these experiences in a very sort of like contained way, or to the way that is right for each participant. So, but yes, level 1 is definitely has a lot to do with consent. And you were asking from a spiritual level, do I feel that consent is the end all be all of the spiritual journey of a human being? No, absolutely not. But I also feel deeply that we all need to build a stable, sufficiently resilient body, mind, personality complex that can interface with others before we can go to other explorations that may be even wanting to transcend that. And this has always been the effort of ISTA, to provide containers for all of those stages of the journey. But definitely we all need to start, no matter our previous experience, from learning about boundaries, about consent, and then maybe for some of us, we want to take the journey to a different direction if that's appropriate.
It's amazing. Katie, if there's anything you want to add, or I can.
No, that was beautiful. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, something that I've learned, I'm a hunter. I've studied death a lot in different ways. I think I had this big insight once that was just like, oh, death isn't consensual. And it's like, and again, we live in a death phobic culture, which is why we have so much, I think, both obsession and struggle with consent, because the fundamental thing that actually underwrites life being a regenerative enterprise is not consensual. Actually, the same way that really being, again, maybe my soul did choose to be born, but at some ego level, I didn't choose to be born. I was here. And there's something I think about, again, being on consent. I think it is important, Raf, as you're saying, to like develop the healthy ego structure that can hopefully have informed consent. So yes and no. But again, we don't know if things are going to turn out, how we're also going to feel about them later. So I think there is a development, which I think ISTA works on, of like, how do we develop self-responsibility for when we bring ourselves into situations, them not feeling always good, and then us being willing to be part of a process. And also as the people that might violate consent in whatever kind of way, I think more than that is ever maybe like ultimately what is traumatizing. I think it's, can we be in a continued relational process of repair? Which is what I've seen ISTA doing here and wanting to continue to do. And I think that's the culture we're trying to build. Again, this, we're not going to get it right and we can't solve it alone. So can we be willing to be in process, to hear discomfortable things about us, feel uncomfortable things, and then be in a larger community process and trust that and trust ourselves to that on all sides?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to ISTA's process of repair in terms of the accountability program that we've initiated. And it is a spiral evolution through, I'll share 5 steps, because when there have been grievances expressed and they weren't cleared just, within the community, because at times, like, stuff comes up, consent violations, for example, arise, and that could be mediated, that can happen in the community, just be cleared. And feedback's really welcome at every training. But then we have the safe mediation if it's something that can't be cleared one-on-one or in community. And then if there's multiple complaints on any of the faculty or the organizers or apprentices, there's an accountability team that can invite faculty into an accountability process, which might be somewhere between 6 months to a year, 6 months to 3 years now, in that journey. And that was the humbling part, is really learning how long it takes and what it takes to go through these 5 steps. And that involves, really understanding the come from of where the grievances are and what happened, and the where the missteps or the blind spots are for the facilitator. But there's understanding, there's getting support, because like we said, if you don't have support, if you don't feel safe, it's defensive and polarized. So building support triads and teams, and then there's taking ownership, like this deep process of beyond the ego's defenses, like how did I co-create this situation? And that ownership takes a long like changing of lenses process before going into amends. And those amends are like really looking at what's needed to reconcile. And that's a lot of our accountabilities. We currently have 3 candidates in this process, like they're working on ownership and haven't gotten to amends, which is the 4th step before repair, and where they feel like, okay, it's all been repaired, and then we can go into coming back onto faculty, because during this process they're often paused from their responsibilities or their roles and need to go through this stages fully supported before being invited back. And they may or may not. It's an unconditional process where they may or may not be invited back, depending on whether or not, it's in alignment.
Mm-hmm. That's so beautiful. And I love just the like community aspect of it, and the like time that it takes. And I think also probably just the mystery, when the mystery has to come in, because we don't know, fully. Like, I think the mystery of like forgiveness and repair, there are steps, but there's also that point in human beings where there is, I think for us, like nobody can force me or anybody else to come to account for my own role in co-creating a situation. That's like kind of my own, I can have support from community, but I think that's a really deep, mysterious journey for me. And it's something I've learned in my own process, and the one I was talking about earlier, like it was really clear to like me that yes, I was in a seat of power and I was ultimately responsible, but that there was a co-creation in the situation. But what I learned is that it's not for like me, whether or not I'm even the one in power, it's not for me as the other to be like, you take account for your side of the like co-create. It's like all I can do, maybe not all I can do, but what is mine to do is take account for my side fully and then trust the field, trust the process, and in some ways pray and hope for there to be that on both sides so we can get to a repair. But if not, be willing for things are not always repaired, and then we go to grief. Then we go to the process. For me, that's the like flow chart. And that's part of the world. There will be things for all of us human beings that just don't get repaired in this life. And that's a place to kneel at the altar of grief and like let that be the healing balm that we might not get relationally, because you can no more than you can truly like force love. You cannot force also accountability. So I think it's a really deep thought to really know there that we can really own it for ourselves. And then there's something else that needs to be trusted. So I see that we're like getting close to or even past our time. This is amazing. I want to give you each a chance just to wrap up any final things you want to say, knowing this was already an in-process dialogue and there's so much more. I'd love to do this again with more time because it seems like this is just the first layer. But passing back to you both, is there anything you want to say just in closing, you know, speaking to the people out there now, speaking to the wider people that might watch this, just as like, yeah, what's true now? What is going forward?
This is humbling and hard. I actually want to thank our critics, like the people who have, come forth with like, hey, this really, sometimes, it's not like it's not in a pretty package, but like we've gotten a lot of feedback. And as hard as it was initially to like swallow, I'm really coming in this place of like that feedback has grown us. That feedback's making us better. Like feedback is a gift. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely resonating with that. Thank you, Katie, for expressing that so beautifully. And so, when I put my eyes in the future, I keep seeing public debates popping up left and right to talk about these issues. So my invitation is for myself and for anyone who feels strongly about these issues of power, of spirituality and sexuality, of embodied spirituality, to be part of the conversation. Like, don't just stay on the sideline. And what I mean by being part of the conversation is actually try it out. Try maybe creating a space, creating a small community space in your hometown or wherever you are, where you can get to actually be in that field and feel what it is like to work with real humans and to navigate. And because maybe you will find ways to navigate these challenges that we haven't found, and we would love to hear that. And there is such a power, when those suggestions and also experiences come from real experience, from the challenging choice of stepping into the codes basically and meddling with them, which is oftentimes gets very messy. So it's wonderful that we have such amazing critics, that are actually part of this conversation, spending their life, their energy, their time, doing experiments as well. And I trust that this is an interesting and fundamental conversation for the wider audience at large. So I'm seeing this kind of spaces crop even more in the future, having public debates and finding solutions that we at ISTA don't even dream of right now. We're just one player in the arena, and we need you who are listening to also step in and write your thoughts or create spaces so that we can all learn together how to move with more integrity, with more respect for the fullness of the human experience, and we can learn from each other. And, I think the whole world is in a state where it's waiting for that. So thank you so much for giving us a chance. And we need more, we need more people, we need more voices, we need more participants in this embodied landed conversation around these themes.
Yeah. Thank you both. And I mean, I feel totally humbled to have been in this role and love to continue the dialogues. Again, I think for me, a principle of like my work with soul, which is a big part of my work in the world, is so much around like the wound becomes the gift when it's really worked. And I feel like the wound that also ISTA has experienced from this, I hope becomes the gift of really continuing to model and be in that, like holding space for that dialogue of like how we can up level ethics and healing and like repair in this way, which is why we had this conversation here.